Welcome, everybody. I am very excited to introduce Bill Cullina as our speaker tonight. Bill is the F. Otto Haas Executive Director at the Morton Arboretum of the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, which is a magical place. It is dear to my heart because I was the Flora of Pennsylvania intern there 14 years ago, well before Bill landed there. As I made a career change and entered the world of public gardens, the first book that became important to me was actually the first book that Bill published, called Wildflowers. It's actually called Growing and Propagating Wildflowers of the United States and Canada, but we know it as Wildflowers. He wrote and published this book and 5 others while he was nursery director and head propagator, and later director of plant research and development at the New England Wildflower Society, now known as Native Plant Trust, which is a well-known Massachusetts entity that focuses on the conservation and promotion of native plants. In between writing books, Bill developed Native Plant Trust's propagation, plant breeding, and plant introduction program. In agriculture and horticulture, plant introduction means to find and obtain plants that have value but may not be popular yet, to propagate them and to distribute them to the public. Bill developed over a dozen unique named native plant cultivars and introduced them to the nursery trade. Bill's career has had a seemingly linear trajectory. He moved on from the Wildflower Society to become the director of horticulture and plant and garden curator at a new garden at that time, which many of us here in New England and beyond are familiar with now, called Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens. Soon thereafter, he became president and CEO. And during his time there, he oversaw the design and construction of many of the gardens and several of the buildings there. He led the construction of a new visitor center, completed a LEED Platinum Education Center, grew membership by 50% and yearly garden attendance by 250%. He also significantly grew the number of staff, launched a sizable capital campaign, and created their first 20-year master plan. Before all of this, Bill obtained a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology at William and Hobart Smith Colleges in New York, and a Bachelor of Science in Plant Sciences at the University of Connecticut, where he concentrated on landscape architecture and horticulture. So Bill's CV is very impressive, but the black and white of words on paper don't tell the whole story of Bill Cullina. Bill and I have met oh so briefly a few times. He may be surprised to learn that. And I have seen him give a presentation once, but I don't know him well. From what I do know of him, from 1 or 2 degrees of separation through others and through listening to a podcast interview he gave, it is obvious to me that Bill is still a student. He is curious, a deep thinker, funny, and actively interested in learning about life in all things living. Picking up on this insight about him, it makes sense that he is so entrenched in the field of public gardens. Public garden is, after all, a community where people, all people and plants exist side by side. So of course he is here to speak at our meeting of the New England Botanical Society, of which he is a member, because his interests and the missions of all of the organizations he's worked for, including his current organization, the Morton Arboretum, align so strongly with ours. If we were to take the missions of all of our organizations that we've worked for and mix them together and distill them down, they would probably say something like to support all people's understanding of and natural affinity for plants. So without further ado, I am pleased to hand over the screen to Bill Cullina and learn from what he has to say about public gardens in today's world.
This is a very nice introduction. I appreciate that. And I just wish I was there in person, because I haven't been in person to a club meeting in a number of years. I'd love to catch up with old friends, but maybe afterwards we can do that. So, but this talk hopefully give you some things to think about of what the purpose of public gardens are in the world today. I honestly believe our purpose has been never more important, and to me, one of the one of the, I guess, the silver linings of COVID is just, I think, people's appreciation of what we do and what we have to offer them and how important we've been to everybody's lives during this really difficult time. What is a public garden? Um, the the definition from the American Public Garden Association, I won't read it all, but basically it's this idea of that there are collections of plants that are there for, fun and education, but there's a research and conservation purpose often. And these collections are actively maintained and recorded. So it's different than a park. Which is really just an open space that's there for for public enjoyment. There's the idea of there's a science overlay and an education overlay to this idea of a public garden. And where do public gardens come from? Well, I mean, going way back, way back to sort of the pre-industrial times, people just lived out in nature, and we gained sustenance from nature. I mean, and I don't think that there was ever this sense of just guessing that there was a sense of that, we're apart from nature. We're just, out living in the world. In, more sort of recent colonial American times, nature was something to be sort of contained and harnessed for food, for shelter, for heat. But again, it was a sort of a utilitarian relationship. This idea of gardens as a garden, as a place of pleasure and relaxation. There's a theory it could have been as old as 500 BC with the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Was this actually a real place? I think there's a question about that. But the Hanging Garden of Babylon were a private garden, so a place where the aristocracy of the time could enjoy and relax. And that theme continued, jumped forward a couple thousand years to England in the 18th, 19th century. The aristocracy developed these estates and these gardens as a way to kind of get out of the growing cities and go to the parks and enjoy nature in a sort of a contrived way. This idea of a sort of a park-like landscape where they could have parties and hunts and that sort of thing. But there was, during this time, especially in the sort of the latter half of the 19th century, there's this growing awareness among the aristocracy in Europe that the people that were living in the cities, the people that were living working in the factories, the children working in the factories, the people were not in a good place. That this sense of kind of moral decay of the Industrial Revolution was something that they worried about. So there was this enlightened movement among the aristocracy to basically create these open spaces for the working class. And it was a little self-serving because they were worried about crime and they were worried about sort of the health of their workers. But there was a movement really to create public spaces for the enjoyment of the public. And it was very much tied with this idea of moral health, that having these beautiful parks and beautiful open spaces led to the moral health of society. And that really is kind of where botanical gardens originated from. Concurrently with that was this Victorian exploration looking for that was tied with kind of the imperialism at the time, going out across the globe on ships, collecting plants, bringing them back for study. This sort of growing interest in taxonomy and the relationship of plants and exploration, and then showing these plants to the public. So botanical gardens became a place of sort of refuge from the city, from the ills of the Industrial Revolution, but also a place to learn about and study plants. This is the Amazon, lilies here at Kew Gardens. And so that's kind of the backdrop. In North America, similar things were going on. I think during the Gilded Age, these great estates of the Gilded Age, like Biltmore, and Longwood and Gardens. And actually, the Morris estate too were built on the backs of the, of this workers of the industrial age. But there was a sort of a sense that we need to convert these spaces to places of beauty for the public. And so the Morris estate, when John and Lydia Morris passed Lydia passed in 1930s, in her will, she deeded her estate to the public by way of the University of Pennsylvania to become a place of enjoyment and study and research, and became the Morris Arboretum that we are today. So it's not the way it always happens. I think one of the interesting things for me is that I worked at Garden in the Woods and the Native Plant Trust, which was a private estate that became public, and Morris Arboretum the same way. But Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens was very much a different kind of a thing. This was a organization that just sort of started as a grassroots efforts to bring a public garden to a part of the world where really there wasn't anything like this. And so their focus was really, as you can see, on education, stewardship, and research, but also this idea of economic development. So Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens is very, very new. And there are many gardens like this across the country that have just started as a grassroots effort to provide a public garden in places where there aren't any, and what you see today. So, why is this important? Why do people feel the need to start these public gardens? I mean, you could do lots of different things with those resources, but I really feel that connection with nature is, one of the most, is an essential part of humanity. I think when I look at cultures around the world, just about every culture has art, every culture has music. But, in the past, all cultures were just intimately connected with nature, right? It was just this sort of, nature was all around you. But now that we're in this, more of a quote unquote civilized societies, it's very hard to really connect with nature. And I think just like art and just like music, we need that connection with the non-human world to really be whole as humans. There's just something visceral, and I'm sure all of you know and experience this when you're out in nature. You just feel whole. You feel that connection with the universe, the sort of the magic, the beauty, the sense of time passing, and the majesty of nature is really something that is, is really all important. And it ties into this idea of biophilia, which is E.O. Wilson's phrase, which you've probably seen before, which is really this idea of that we have this deep-seated human need to connect with the non-human, and without that, I think there's this idea that we're just not healthy without that. And when you look at the research that is coming out now about how important nature is to human health, psychological health especially, but also physical health, looking at anxiety and depression among adults, among children, and how children learn better when they're outside. There's just so much research coming out, which I think is, to me, in some ways it's obvious. Again, it's just like saying you can't listen to music. You can't have any kind of art in your life. If you can't have any kind of nature in your life, it's a very similar kind of a thing. And looking at in hospital rooms, even just bringing flowers into somebody's, we do that when a loved one is sick and we bring in flowers, but having plants and having flowers, or even just a picture of a beautiful forest scene in a hospital room was seen to, lower blood pressure, speed recovery, and reduce pain. So it's obvious that this is something that's real. But the problem is that as we have moved into the cities and as we've been kind of disconnected from the natural world, I think the public harbors a lot of fear around nature. There's this sense that if I go out into the woods, I could get bitten by a mosquito. I could be attacked by a bear. I could get lost. And I think if you look at that in the amount of, if you've been to a national park or a state park and you go off the trails, nobody's out there really. People don't want to venture out into sort of what I would call like true nature, unless you're a botanist, then you do. So props to the botanists out there. But I think where public gardens really can, fill that niche is sort of safe nature, right? We've got paths, we've got handrails, we've got water bodies that you can explore without worrying about getting lost and that sort of thing. And so it really, I think, again, provides this connection in a way that really works with modern society. Accessibility is a huge issue. It's obviously, if you're in a wheelchair or have mobility issues, you can't go take a hike in the woods. So how do you connect with nature, a park or a botanical garden? It's a calm place to go and just sit and talk and relax and lower that blood pressure. It's a chance to walk with a loved one, to look at beautiful flowers. This is a study that was looking at the University of Delaware, looking at like what did people appreciate about being at a public garden. And probably no surprises here: trees and flowers and ponds and wooded areas and bright colors. So this just, I think it's sort of, nature magnified, nature intensified a little bit. But there's also this social aspect to it. And that's what we found with the research we've done here at the Morris Arboretum. The number one reason that people come to the Morris Arboretum is to have a social experience in quote unquote nature. And that's very important too. So having paths where you can stroll and talk, places where you can sit and engage. It's really, I think, feeding our soul in different ways. It's that connection with nature, but also connection with people all in one place. So when looking at, the reasons for visiting, and this has been the case, this is interesting. This was not our study, but this is really the similar results we've gotten, that this idea of social engagement and relaxation, inspiration are the most important reasons. Unfortunately for us educators, the educational function, it doesn't rate as highly in questionnaires, but I think a lot of the times is if you use the word learn, people will respond lower than if you use other words too. So we have to kind of sneak in the learning too, because that's an important part of what we do, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Public gardens are also a place of celebration, of celebrating the milestones of life, of birth, of weddings, of death. At the Morris Arboretum, these are some pictures from some of our weddings. I mean, we have a lot of weddings and celebrations of life and birthday parties, and I just love that. I love the fact that we can have a place that's out in amongst the trees where people can really mark those milestones of life. And it's also about celebrating the milestones of the season, the Halloween, the holidays. This is the conservatory at Longwood during the holidays, and the holiday light show at Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens, really just sort of celebrating those passing of the seasons. But of course, it's all about the plants too, right? And I think public gardens really, because we collect, we have collections, because we label the plants, because we talk about the plants, it's really celebrating plants and nature. And that's really important too. When you go to a park, you can do a lot of those things, but you can't really learn and connect with plants as individuals. And I really think that, if we're going to, you can't save what you don't understand. And I think really that connecting people with this idea that plants are individuals, that there's different species of trees, that there's different species of trilliums. This is really important to try to educate folks about the importance of conservation and conserving diversity. it's not just plants too. It's connecting them with all the things that depend on plants besides us. The butterflies and the bees and the mammals and that sort of thing. So really, that celebrating the biodiversity, celebrating those connections of life that I think, and the reality is in many ways, people just don't have a way to experience that and understand that. And that can be outside, like this is the butterfly house at Coastal Maine Botanical Garden, or in places like conservatories, which for students especially are really important, because during the school year, unfortunately, in temperate areas, a lot of the plants are not in flower. So conservatories provide that sort of need too. Research is important at public gardens, and most public gardens have some kind of active research program. Could be horticultural research, and really a lot of the interesting horticultural research, choke over my words there, is happening at public gardens, understanding especially things like seed propagation, propagating non-commercial species of plants, developing new cultivars and that sort of thing. This has been a lot of my work in the past, is really trying to understand how we can grow these plants, which has benefit for both horticulture, but also for conservation too. Plant trials and trying to understand what are appropriate plants to introduce to gardens. I think this is something that is very important now, as we really try to steer people more toward native species, away from things that are potentially invasive. We need to do the research to back that about what plants are going to grow well in cultivation, are going to perform and bloom well. This is a study that Mount Cuba Center nearby just did about the Hydrangea arborescens, and it's a really great model, I think, for sort of plant trials, because they went beyond just, this is a bigger flower, this is more drought tolerant. They were actually looking at pollinator visits in this study too, and which different cultivars had the most pollinator visits, and also the most diversity of pollinator visits. So I encourage you to go, if you're interested, to go to Mount Cuma's website and download that. It's really a very interesting study. Plant breeding is important too, and again, trying to develop work with plants that aren't really out in the horticulture trade, that may be untried or that have real potential, like the Baptisias here. This is a plant breeding. Jim Alt at Chicago Botanical Garden has done a tremendous amount to popularize cultivars of native species to go into the nursery trade, that can, not only the sort of the better garden plants, but also the marketing around them to get people using more of those too. Public gardens are also a real center for botany and conservation biology research. The ex situ conservation really has its, has its center in public gardens, and whether it's plants, or I think more importantly, seed banking. This is the Millennium Seed Bank at Kew, where they're really trying to conserve, I've forgotten, and some of you on there might know, but I think it's something like 15% of the world's diversity of trees and herbaceous plants. It's a huge undertaking. And just doing that basic research on something like the Wollemi pine, how can we propagate this plant? How can we spread this plant around in cultivation? Species that are very, very limited in nature, to try to hedge their bets in case something happened to a species like that. A little closer to home, I mean, we're in a very troubling period of extinction in our native forest. It's something that I'm very concerned about, but very interested in too. I've lived through. I didn't really make the chestnut and the elm extinction, but certainly lived through the hemlock extinction. Now emerald ash borer on the ash trees. We're seeing several diseases attacking beeches and oaks. It's really a sort of an assault on our our eastern forests, and it's something that I feel like we need to do something about. And just trying to, at the Morris Arboretum, we're getting involved in research now where we're looking for where natural resistance among trees. This is hemlocks that have resistance to hemlock woolly adelgid, and there's a couple different pathways for resistance there among hemlocks that you can actually identify through molecular genetics, and be able to breed these plants from different ecotypes that have resistance to hemlock woolly adelgid. The same is true for emerald ash borer, which is really wiped out most of the ash species in Pennsylvania. There's still a few live trees. There's a few what we call lingering ashes, which about 1 in 10,000 trees seems to have some natural resistance. This is looking here, that that picture on the right is what you see is the trail of the larvae that, where the larvae has actually died. So they, whereas the one in the center, the larvae is active. And so looking for these plants, identifying the genetic markers for resistance, and then breeding with them across different, the range of the species to try to help bring the species back before we lose all that genetic diversity, is something that I think is really, really important. And we're actually now at the Morris advertising for a PhD plant geneticist position to do this kind of work. We're setting up a lab to be able to do the molecular genetics and the plant breeding to hopefully do our part to help potentially bring back some of these forest species. Climate change is an issue that's on our minds and everybody's minds too. This is looking at Pennsylvania, eastern Pennsylvania. In the next 50 years or so, we're looking at a climate much more like North Carolina, maybe even farther south. And so we're looking for the sort of the plants for the future, plants that we're in the northern Piedmont ecoregion, and we're looking at species that are farther south in that ecoregion that could be potential new plants for us. It's not just in the forest, it's also Philadelphia is a very urban place, and trees are providing all those things that I talked about, that connection with nature that people need, but we're losing our urban tree canopy. These are sugar maples that are dying. The range of sugar maple there in yellow is projected to retreat pretty much up into Canada over the next 50 years or so. So we need to be thinking about what we can plant as street trees that are going to be the plants that'll be around in 50 years. So we're doing, we're having trips down to farther south to look for those things. One of the interesting candidates is Virginia live oak. This is a species that you can see gets about to the Delmarva Peninsula. So going down to the northern limit of its range, collecting those seeds from those populations and growing them up in the nursery, and then trialing them out in our field nursery. We've really been able to find selections that have performed really well that we're going to trial out to street trees. It's amazing, some of the work that public gardens do around to basically track the impacts of climate change is really very interesting, and especially with trees that have been there a long time. This is longleaf pine, Pinus palustris, which is a southeastern species. And the large one there on the left is a plant that's here at the Morris Arboretum. This is a tree that 30 years ago would defoliate 1 out of 3 years and barely survive, but it was able to survive. Now it grows perfectly well. And so, this is to me a clear indicator that our climate has warmed significantly in the last 30 years or so. We're looking at more kind of controversial things in the public garden work too, like assisted migration. I know that this is something that's talked a lot about in conservation circles, about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. But this is looking at the Apalachicola area of Florida, which is one of the real biodiversity hotspots of the eastern U.S. And it's because back in the last glacial period, all those species moved from the Smokies and the Blue Ridge Mountains down to that period as refugia, plants like Magnolia ashii, Torreya taxifolia. The problem is that now that the climate has warmed, they've gotten down there, but they can't get back. And Torreya especially is a species that is basically going extinct. And so the question is, do we just let that species go extinct, or do we look at potentially trying to help that move? It's getting harder and harder for plants to move because the climate's changing very quickly, and also because of urbanization. So here, we're growing Torreya taxifolia here in the nursery. Down at the Biltmore estate, they're doing quite a lot of work with this species, where they're propagating it and planting it out in suitable habitats in the Smokies, where it's actually quite happy. But is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? I think it's part of the research questions that we're working on. But I think, again, it's all about the plants, and this is something that when you think about how we can connect with the average person in the world today, connect with them about something that we all know is like how important our plants are, not only to ourselves, but to humanity. And really, I think that's one of the most important functions that we have as public gardens. We're really the ambassadors for the plants, because they can't do that for themselves. But if all the plants suddenly disappeared on Earth, how long would life persist? The estimate is about 70 days. And the sad thing is that, and that focus on botanical research is really on the decline. I mean, this is looking at biological sciences and changes in attendance, even just in 5 years. And you see that botany, as we all know, as fewer and fewer schools offer, botany as a program, as a graduate degree. But even in just 5 years, there was the steepest decline among any of the programs among the biological sciences. You can see sports medicine, that's gone up quite a bit, but botany, that's down, and that's very concerning. And I really feel that public gardens are not only the refugia for some of these rare species, but the refugia for field botany, for floristics, because we need to use access to private philanthropy to be able to support these things, and to support the herbaria, to support the field research that's not happening at the universities anymore. Harvard's number 3, but if the 2 largest herbaria in the U.S. are at botanical gardens, New York Botanical Garden and Missouri Botanical Garden. And so, this is a project that we just undertook, the digitization of all the herbaria in the Mid-Atlantic. We've got 2.5 million specimens that we digitized here at the Morton Arboretum through a grant in collaboration to basically, as you all know, get those specimens out there on the web so they can be studied and used. But again, I feel that botany as a science needs to find a home at botanical gardens. Food is also really important too, and connecting people with food. One of the places that people don't go to farms anymore like they used to. We don't live on farms, but especially in more urban areas, botanical gardens become that link with what we eat and how we prepare that food, how we preserve that food. It's something that I think is we've seen explosive growth in this and food and food plants at public gardens, showing people how they can grow these things, how they can harvest and preserve them, and then even things like demonstration cooking. This is here at Chicago, where the chefs come in and show people how to cook. I think it's to me a great connection when you can see the plants, learn how to grow them, and then see how to use and prepare those things in your own kitchen. not to forget education. I think this is another important role that we play, really a crucial role that we play, especially around children's education, um, because uh, we know that the school systems, and they're taxed and they have their requirements they have to to meet, and especially in urban areas like we are here, there's really just no outlet for kids to actually get out into nature, that sort of biophilia need that they have. And it's something that we put a lot of emphasis on here at the Morris Arboretum. We have 6,000 or so school kids come here every year to just spend time in nature, to learn a little bit, to tie in with their curricula. Um, it's a sort of part of a larger problem of science literacy, which is, I mean, science literacy, this is one definition. It's basically, it's a pretty low bar. It's really just understanding, the basics of what science and the scientific method is. And if you see, we haven't made a lot of progress here. This is, that graph is about 10 years old, but basically most folks in this country, a little over, a little less than 3/4 of the country really fail on the basic scientific literacy. So I think that, not only we can connect kids with nature, but we can teach them a little bit about science too. And it's not just kids, it's this lifelong learning. This is, here at Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens, getting the kids out there, getting the adults out there, holding a pine cone, pulling up a radish. This is at the Dallas Arboretum, where they have a more sophisticated science education program that I really appreciate. And then, and beyond just the basics, it's also career development. We are just having, next week, we're having our female tree climbing workshop that we do to encourage women to get into the arborist trade. We do professional workshops. Longwood Gardens has a very great professional program that they do, trying to connect people with jobs in the green industry. It's a real need that we have to get more people into horticulture, arboriculture, and we're providing services there that the universities really are not too. And so finally, I'm just going to wrap up with economic impact. I mean, as an executive director, I always have to think about budgets, but I also think about like all the money that is flowing from public gardens out into the community. This is a map of the public gardens in the country, and the sort of by density, and you can see that throughout the eastern seaboard and throughout the west, but making inroads into the center part of the country, there are a lot of public gardens, and those are gardens that are staffed by people that are working, that have jobs, that are supporting families, that are that are out there volunteering in their communities. We did an economic impact study here among the greater Philadelphia gardens, and estimating that $256 million a year in total economic impact from our sort of combined, and over 1,500 jobs were created directly at these public gardens. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a broader sense about what we do, and I'm sure you appreciate the work that public gardens do, but maybe you appreciate it a little bit more. So I thank you for your kind attention, and I'm going to stop sharing and see if we have any questions or comments, or what do you think, Sarah?
Okay, hi. Great talk. Thank you so much for highlighting the importance of public gardens. It's almost like a gateway to plants, a gateway to nature for people. That's also how I see it, for sure. So we'll start with Lorraine's question. Lorraine Washburn, she wrote, "Can you please talk a bit about your thoughts around selection and breeding of native plants?" So you have a lot of history there. Given the potential for genetic exchange with conspecifics in the region of plantings of these cultivars. So
yeah, I think that's a great question, and there's a lot more questions than answers, when it comes to gene flow and, impact on wild populations. I think, most of the plants that are in, I would just, there's a phlox cultivar that I introduced back when I was at Noma Wildflower Society called Blue Moon, that now got the Garden Club America. It's like the plant of the year. That's a seedling of wild phlox that we just selected that had a little bit larger flowers. So it's really hasn't been manipulated, and that's it's just been, it's just one. So it doesn't have the genetic diversity that a whole seed population does, but it's different than, I think, a really highly manipulated plant. Like you think about something like some of the cone flowers that are out there, where they've been they're not even native to New England, and they've been highly manipulated. And I think there's honestly, if you're trying to just get the average person to think about the importance of why native plants are important and their impact on other things, like, it's okay to me if it's something that's a little bit manipulated, because to me that sort of plant blindness is the bigger issue. I certainly, if you're talking about really reintroduction to the wild, that's a whole nother question. And I think that's where you have to really be looking at provenance and genotypes and doing things a lot more scientifically. So it's hard to answer that kind of question very succinctly, but it's part of the work that I really would like to do here once we get our molecular lab up, to look at some of these genetic questions that we just don't have solutions for. And that's what I liked about that Mount Cuba study, because they were looking at some of the questions around pollinator visitation and pollinator use of some of these cultivars versus the native plants.
Yeah, I think they did a phlox study that was similar too, and echinacea and a few other things. Yeah, along the lines of cultivars and nativars and things like that. That's a good point, because, for example, with the American chestnut, as I understand it, right, the American chestnut has been crossed with a Chinese variety, or a Chinese species, and then back crossed until a lot of the genetics from the Chinese species are kind of not existent in the plant, but it is now resistant to the blight. And so I was wondering if you have any idea yet, as the new plant geneticist works with the hemlock and the, what's the other species you're going to be working on at the Morris?
Hopefully the ash, different ash species, probably, white ash primarily. Yeah.
Okay. Is that kind of the plan? Do you know if they're going to be back crossing, or if they're going to be doing something else?
I think not using, we do have Asian ash species in our collection that are resistant. But I think it's really more looking at resistance among the native populations. And I mean, when there's a couple of things happening, like American chestnut, when they started that work, it was 75 years ago, I think. We didn't have modern molecular genetics labs, right? So they were just crossing and back crossing, and it still hasn't yielded a plant that really is pretty much as we think of as an American chestnut that's reliably resistant. Now there's a lab, and I don't know if they've talked for the club before, but it's really interesting work they're doing at SUNY Syracuse, where they actually used CRISPR technology to insert a gene from barley that creates an enzyme, oxalic oxidase, that deactivates the oxalic acid that the fungus uses to kill the tree. So they've got a tree now that is pretty much completely resistant, and they did it very, very quickly. And so they're working. They did the work really quickly, but it's taken about 20 years for that plant to go through the USDA process to get released. It's probably going to get released next year, and I think that's a question about, what's the future of GMOs in restoration. It's something that we're thinking about too, because it has the promise to solve a lot of these problems very, very quickly. But of course, could create a lot of new problems too. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. But I do think that um, even despite that, what you can do with the with molecular breeding is you can identify resistance genes among a seedling group and select for those very quickly, especially with trees, because you think about a tree, it takes a long time to grow it, 10 years or something like that, to see if it's resistant. But if you can do that on a seedling, you can save a lot of time. And so I think whether we go into the GMO part of it or not, just the molecular stuff opens up, it speeds up the process exponentially.
Which is, we don't have a lot of time with the.
No, and that's the thing is that, when you look at ash, that the genotypic diversity of that species of, say, green ash or white ash, black ash, whatever it is, if only 1 in 10,000 is surviving this, that's going to be a huge hit to the diversity of that species.
Yeah. Lisa Stanley asks, what are the biggest challenges facing public gardens? That's a nice.
Geez, Lisa, that's an easy question. Thank you for that, Lisa. That's a hard question. I think, a lot of the challenges are the same challenges that all nonprofits face. I think, but looking at, competing for funding. Most public gardens are not funded by tax dollars. Like the Morris Arboretum is not funded by tax dollars. We're not actually funded much in the way of Penn. We have to raise our own money. We're competing with lots of very other worthy causes. About things like hunger and poverty and animal extinctions and that kind of thing. But certainly funding is probably the biggest challenge, and that's why a lot of public gardens do things like having these traveling shows with the dinosaurs and lights and things like that, and people might think, oh, it's just becoming Disneyland. But one of the public gardens that I have the most respect for as far as their research program, the Morton Arboretum, they're doing amazing research there. And I asked the director there, how do you fund your research? And they said, it's our light shows, it's our admissions, it's our, pumpkin festivals and that kind of thing. So I think we got to realize that, some of this stuff that may seem a little theme parky is really helping to fund some of this basic research too.
Yeah. And I think also when you're thinking about challenges facing public gardens, you have to think about, like, who are you talking to? Who are you asking that question to? Because, obviously, at least from your talk tonight, I felt that you have a strong scientific kind of bent. So maybe that's, to you, one of the biggest challenges. I know I've thought about it too, and like a big challenge is getting people to the gardens. And I think that those light displays that you're talking about, and the pumpkin shows, and I know there's a scarecrow show at the Morris Arboretum. Getting people there is kind of the first step, and then getting them interested in plants maybe is the second step. But okay, from Kate, if there is one change that you'd like to see other botanic gardens do differently with regards to their research programs, what would it be?
That's another really difficult question. Because I think there's so many different programs out there. So I don't want to criticize anybody that's actually engaged with research. I feel that what I said in the talk, I really believe that private philanthropy and one thing botanical gardens are good at is private philanthropy, not government, science grants, municipal funding, but getting private philanthropy to support the research, like, basic botanical research and conservation research and the kind of things we're talking about. I think that's really where because, well, I'm part of a university. Penn is one of the great research universities in the world. But primarily Penn is focused on medical research. So we're carving out this niche to focus on plants, but we can leverage some of that, philanthropic power to do that kind of work, because it's tough, as you know, to get the federal funding to do this kind of basic plant science.
Yeah. Along those lines, and I think maybe you already have answered this in other questions, but Patty says, can you speak a little more about how you envision public gardens promoting botanical study? I mean, maybe you didn't answer that yet.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to see what folks in the audience feel about this. I think, I mean, I'm very proud of my wife Melissa's work that she's doing in Maine. I mean, we just decided to create an herbarium, and she's created an herbarium and botanical research and education around that. I think that's really what it takes. Is it takes the leadership committing to it, and actually hiring the botanical staff. And because I think what we see here, we have Tim Block, who you worked with, and Cindy Schema, our botanists, and they teach at Penn. They also teach here. That they taught a basic botany class for undergraduates at Penn last year. They had 35 students sign up for that, and I was thrilled by that, and there's not even a botany program at Penn. So I don't know, maybe it was just unusual, but I just feel like maybe this, there's a sort of a nascent research interest in this as a profession, but it has to start with commitments for the organizations that this is important, hiring the professionals to do the work and to do some of this, the work that Melissa's doing in Maine is complementing the work of the state botanists. But I mean, unfortunately, the state botanists have to spend most of their time now on regulatory issues, and although they want to be out doing that kind of floristics and basic work, don't have the thing. So I think how we can complement the state botanists is really something that I think a lot about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So right in the beginning of your talk, you talked about how many public gardens have private estate roots. And I was just curious if you feel like there are any public gardens that are sort of leading the charge of overcoming these private estate roots. So to me, a private estate is, because of its nature of being owned by an individual, being somebody's property, and we're not supposed to trespass on people's property, right? It seems very exclusive of people. And I'm just curious if you can think of any gardens that are kind of overcoming that private feeling and getting the public there in really, inclusive ways. Because I know that's an issue that a lot of public gardens that have previously been private estates have. They're like, well, we're not private anymore, but we can't get people on our grounds.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's something that we wrestle with here at the Morris. We're in the middle of a new master plan here, and one of the things, if you've never been to the Morris Arboretum, you come in through an iron fence that has sort of the spikes on top of it, and you come in through a gate and you go up a long hill, which is where the old mansion was. There's this sense of that as driving by, that this is not a place that is welcome to me. And so it's something that, we're looking at, taking out the metal fences, and changing this whole, the way people approach and how they access doing work with the communities around us, to talk to them about like what the barriers are that they see to coming. And some of it is just stuff you don't really necessarily think about, but I feel it's one of the critical issues that we face right now, is how to stay relevant, how to stay meaningful to the, to serve the populations that, and when you look at like, Philadelphia is 60-something% African American. We want our visitation to reflect the, the population of the city that we serve. So.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think working with the neighborhoods around you, definitely finding out what they need is wise.
But
Another
I
question.
should
Yeah.
say that I think the best model for that is Denver Botanical Garden. I think if they've done an incredible job.
Yeah.
And so to me, they're the model for how to, and then locally to us, Bartram's, which, Bartram's Garden has this great botanical history, but they've just reinvented themselves as a community resource. And my Trey is the director there. She's done a fabulous job.
Awesome. That's great. One more question from me. And then if anybody else has any more
I
questions.
saw Arabella wrote something in. I think.
Well, she wanted to, she was the one who asked if people would have access to the talk afterward.
Oh,
Yeah.
hi, Arabella.
So this is just a curiosity. So at both the Native Plant Trust and Coastal Maine, you did a lot of creating of new landscapes, new buildings, running new physical aspects of the gardens. And I was just wondering if that's kind of a specialty of yours, is starting new programs and finding new ways of looking at things, and what you're able to do at the Morris, because the Morris has kind of a footprint that is filled already, with not a lot of space to create new things. So are you?
That's what you think, but it's not true. Because we
Okay.
got this whole, like the other side of the street, where I live, where there's a lot of potential. No, I think that I like that idea of trying to just reinvent and stay relevant and think about how you can new ways to serve the mission and serve the public. And I think with the Morris Arboretum, we do have 165 acres or so, and the challenge at Morris Arboretum really is that if you go, it's that whole thing about going up the hill and parking and then walking back down. And what's fascinating to me about this master plan we're working on now is that most of the places that people go at the Morris Arboretum are at the same elevation. But by going up to the top and parking and having to go down, it creates accessibility issues that are really hard to overcome for a lot of folks. And so just looking at that, like if we just change where you park and change how you come in, and how you access the site, not only you access the sort of the historic parts of it, but the natural areas that we have and across the street and some of these living history things we do. To me, that's just really, that's very energizing to me. It's like how you can basically take a site that maybe feels like it's basically, it is what it is, and reimagine it as something better.
Nice. Okay, well, I don't think there are any more questions. So thank you so much, Bill. That was fantastic.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, everybody.